what I'd like to do is I'd like to think about the two sort of ideas that are implicit right here in the first line of our program. In our program, it says, as Baptists, we believe that the church is a voluntary association of believers. So we have two ideas there that we're embracing. First, as Baptists, we mean that we only baptize believers. We only baptize believers upon credible profession of faith. And then we believe that the church is a voluntary association of believers, meaning that the state can't coerce people to join a national church. We don't believe in a state church, a comprehensive church in which all members of the nation are members of the state. And so these two ideas are two ideas that I think are closely interrelated. They're logically related, they're theologically related, but they're also historically related. And so this afternoon and Thursday, what I'd like to explore is the way in which these two ideas are interwoven together, and how historically, when we look at the first English Baptists, the Calvinistic or particular Baptists that emerged during the late 1630s and early 1640s, what we see is that these men and women embraced believers' baptism, I would argue, because they had first embraced a believer's church. The idea of a believer's church is interesting because I think that it has sort of been vindicated by the passage of time, hasn't it? I think this is sort of the default way in which most Christians today understand the church as a voluntary association of believers. I think if you asked most Christians, whatever their denomination or background, if you asked non-Christians, walk up to somebody at Tesco and ask them, what is the church? I think they would give you a definition that is more or less commensurate with that printed in our program. It's a voluntary association of like-minded believers. But what we need to realize, of course, is that when we think historically, this was not always the case. It was not always the case. In fact, quite the opposite was the case. And the Reformation that we've spent the last year celebrating the birth of was a wonderful recovery of the gospel, but it didn't quite make good on the logic of the gospel as that logic is played out in the life of the local church. Because the believer's church is an ecclesiology that is in keeping with the soteriology of the Reformation. But the magisterial reformers, as the name implies, magisterial, magistrate, the king, the prince, the godly ruler, or perhaps not so godly, this strand of the Reformation didn't make good on the logic of their soteriology. That would not come until the 17th century. And during the 17th century, what we see congregationalists emerging who embrace this idea of the church as the believer's church. And then some of those congregationalists go on to reject infant baptism. And so I want to explore why they made those moves and how that second move, the rejection of paedobaptism, was really the corollary and the logical outworking of the first move, the rejection of the rejection of the state church and the embrace of the believer's church. So that's the basic logic that we want to go over. And the way we'll do this, there we go. Part one, today we're going to talk about why did the reformers embrace paedobaptism and a national church in the first place? So why were these ideas the sort of de facto position for the magisterial reformers? And then in our second session on Thursday, we'll talk about, let me tell you, what it would have said was, there it is. Why did some English Puritans reject paedobaptism and a national church? So there we have the flow today. Why did the reformers embrace paedobaptism and a national church? And then part two, why did some English Puritans reject paedobaptism and a national church? That's how we're going to see this develop. But first, just a bit of background. And I think for many of us here, this will be familiar territory, but let's just review this together. Historians like to divide early English Baptists into two groups. We have particular Baptists and general Baptists. Now, we should note that the mid-17th century people to whom these labels are applied, they didn't use these names for themselves. They didn't use these labels, but they would go on to use these labels, and historians will basically use them to talk about anyone who's rejecting infant baptism during the 17th century. So with particular Baptists, general Baptists, these names are to do with, in the first instance, the extent of the atonement. So particular Baptists tell us that Christ died for a particular people, for God's elect. Whereas general Baptists are going to maintain that Christ died for all people in general. And these are the basic two divisions. Now, in practice, there's actually quite a bit more that divides these two groups. And in the 17th century, they really have very little to do with each other. But this is sort of the shorthand that has developed. And we're going to focus, of course, on the particular Baptists, or Calvinistic Baptists, Reformed Baptists, whatever you want to call them. And these are the people who drafted the Confessions of Faith, the London Baptist Confessions of Faith in 1644, the first London Baptist Confession, and then 1689 we get the more well-known Second London Baptist Confession that we still adopt in many of our churches today. And what we need to realize about these particular Baptists is that they emerged during what was an extremely chaotic time. They're emerging during the 1640s, which, of course, is a time in which all of English society, culturally, religiously, politically, is, as many were fond of saying in the day, turned on its head. It was a world turned upside down. This is a woodcut that was popular in the early 1640s that shows a world turned upside down. So you have all these silly things with fish flying and dogs and cats swimming and a cart being pushed by its horse and all sorts of things. This is how people perceived it at the time. And indeed, this is how it was. You had the collapse of political and cultural and church life as people knew it. So, of course, you have the English Civil Wars, which are raging. And then in the church sphere, in the ecclesiastical sphere, we see a complete breakdown of episcopal authority. The Church of England, as it had been operating up until that time, breaks down. William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is actually imprisoned. And then in 1645, he is executed. So the church, as it had been known up until that point, seems all of a sudden up for grabs. And of course, the task of rebuilding the church is handed over to the Westminster Assembly of Divines. And they are given the task of reforming the Church of England. So you can see then that this point in which the 1644 First London Baptist Confession is published is a time of tremendous flux. And everything felt on the table. And so it makes sense then that you're seeing all these new religious ideas and movements emerging. And our 1644 London Particular Baptists are one such sort of new religious confession and movement put out on the table. And the last thing we can say about these individuals as way of background is that we should recognize that the signatories of the London Baptist Confession of Faith did not consider themselves to be Anabaptists. When we talk about Anabaptists, we're talking about people on the continent, often the most notorious coming from Germany. These are the people that Martin Luther had very mean things to say about. These were people who, yes, rejected paedobaptism, but they're operating on a somewhat different theological stream from the individuals who sign and write the 1644 London Baptist Confession. Those who sign and write this confession are, in fact, really Puritan Congregationalists. In fact, the people who sign this are disproportionately associated with a London Congregational church that was founded by a man named Henry Jacob in 1616. And this London Independent Church or Congregational Church is where these men and women are coming from. And so what we need to think about when we think about them is we need to, I think, it's not always helpful, especially in these early years, to think of them as Baptists with a big B. But I think it's rather helpful to think about them as Congregationalists, Puritans, who reject paedobaptism, who become convicted that paedobaptism is not biblical. And I think if we shift that, it helps us to get into the mindset, really, of the mid-17th century, in which you wouldn't have had these hard and fast denominational boundaries. Those would emerge somewhat later. All right. So what we're saying then is that there's this tight link between Baptists and Congregationalists. There's a tight link between believers' baptism and the believer's church. And to sort of highlight and illustrate this tight connection, and to illustrate the fact that people were seeing this at the time, let me just share an incident with you. This comes from 1641. This was described as an extreme cold and frosty time, the winter of 1641, and Thomas Wynell was uneasy. Wynell was the Oxford-trained rector serving the Cranham parish near Gloucester. And he had become disturbed by a disquieting report circulating about people he would have regarded as Anabaptists, who he was told had been creeping out in the night to rebaptize diverse men and women in the River Severn. And as Wynell made inquiries, his unease grew. He says, "I found the face of things much altered and strangely leaning to the heresy of the Anabaptists." Well, he did not like Anabaptists. He did not like rebaptizers as he saw them. So he went to his parish church, and he delivered an excoriating series of sermons in which he blasted the Anabaptist error. He just said that the refusal to baptize an infant, he said, was a wickedness so heinous, so horrible, so full of impiety and hellish cruelty that he found himself left, quote, without words to express it. Well, he nonetheless found the words, and in fact, he published this book, The Covenant's Plea for Infants, 1642, and in many respects, this is a rather unremarkable book. He goes through all the passages that you would expect, all the passages that you might bring up with your Paedo-Baptist brothers and sisters today, the passage that was just read in our hearing from the book of Acts, for instance. He goes through all of these, and he gives sort of the Paedo-Baptist case. It's rather unremarkable in many respects. However, there is one striking turn of phrase that I think is illustrative of what we're talking about today. He gives us this interesting passage here in which he says, "The point between us and the complete Anabaptists is simply concerning paedobaptism. If my controversy lay with the semi-Anabaptists, I would lay my proposition in other terms. But the complete Anabaptist doth hold that no child in infancy is baptizable. Let his parents be never so holy, and let the administration be never so pure." Now, we don't need to get too caught up in all the detail here, but what I think is important to see is this odd little phrase here. He talks about complete Anabaptists and semi-Anabaptists. Now, this is a very strange little turn of phrase. I haven't actually seen this in other contemporary treatises, but it's very interesting that he uses it here. So what is he doing here? Who is he talking about? Well, when he talks about complete Anabaptists, it seems fairly clear that he's talking about those whom we would call just Baptists, those who will not baptize, and infant baptism is reserved for believers. But who are these semi-Anabaptists? And again, we won't concern ourselves with all the detail of what he says here, but that little phrase at the end, let his parents be never so holy and let the administration be never so pure, that gives the game away. He's talking there about Congregationalists. He's talking about Congregationalists because Congregationalists, they were happy to baptize infants, but they wanted to restrict that practice to the infants of godly parents. So if you're not a believer, if you're not what a Congregationalist would call a visible saint, someone who can give evidence of saving faith, then they don't want to baptize your baby. Whereas parish ministers like this gentleman at the time, Wynell, he was happy enough to have virtually everyone's baby be baptized. Anyone in the parish. This was a national church. So this conjunction is interesting, and it draws a connection between this congregational position and the Baptist position that I think is worth teasing out. And that's what I hope we can do here, to see the connection, the logical relationship between a congregational commitment to a believer's church and a Baptist commitment to believers' baptism. So let's draw this out. And I think if we can do this together, I think it will help us in a couple of ways. First, it'll help us to understand the logic of a believer's church. By seeing its relationship to baptism, we see the logic of a believer's church, and we see the importance of a believer's church. We see how vital a biblical concept this is, that the church be composed of men and women who believe and who profess faith credibly. Second, it helps us to understand, and this one I think is quite important, why the first English Baptists abandoned paedobaptism in the first place. And we'll return to this in a moment. But why did they abandon paedobaptism when they did? And then third, I think this can help us to minister more effectively today. And I think it can give our paedobaptist brothers and sisters some things to think about that I don't know are always at the forefront of the back and forth between Baptist and paedobaptist. So we'll think about this then together. And I do think that when we think about the 1644 Confession, London Baptist, particular Baptists, in a way, to me, the strangest thing about these particular Baptists is the fact that they came to exist at all. Now, why would that be? Well, it's interesting because the signatories of this confession, when you look at them, those about whom we know something, what we see is that in the main, these gentlemen were not fanatical, fringe zealots. But rather, in the main, the gentlemen who signed this confession were practitioners of a sort of mainstream Puritan congregational divinity. They weren't wild-eyed. There were wild-eyed people operating at this time. There were people who had some very out-there ideas, but these weren't them. These people, in fact, were basically down the line Puritan congregational folks who could have signed off on the Westminster Standards in the main, and in fact later, as we know, they did in fact adopt the Westminster Standards as their own. So the question then is, if these individuals were so sort of orthodox, really, why did they depart so radically from the long-standing Christendom practice of baptizing babies? Because really, when you think about it, the idea that you would baptize the infants in your churches, this idea is one of the few things that all three historical branches of Christendom could agree upon. Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, magisterial reformers all agreed on this point at least, that you should baptize your baby. And yet these gentlemen, at great personal cost to themselves, turn away from that. Why did they do it? And we have to really recover this because today, we're used to baptism. We're used to believers' baptism. We know lots of Baptists. We have conferences like this. In the United States, the Southern Baptist Convention is the single largest Protestant denomination. We have websites like this one I found where you can buy 32 different kinds of baptistries online and a little warmer to heat the water. We're used to it. But it wasn't always so. It wasn't always so. And that when the 1644 came out, we have to work a little bit to recover just how radical a break it was with everything that had come before. So then, how do we think about this? How do we think about this radical move? Why did they do it? Now, of course, at this point, you're thinking, well, why did they do it? That's obvious. They did it because it's not in the Bible. They abandoned paedobaptism because they read their Bibles. And there are no babies that are baptized in the New Testament. This is an easy one, right? And of course, in a sense, yeah, I agree. That's true. And often, if you read the histories of this period, you will find that that's what most historians say. So, for example, Philip Gora, who is a historian of Puritanism, he says this, put most simply, the Baptists asked their critics to accept what they found in unalterable fact. Infant baptism had no scriptural warrant. Because they found no express biblical injunction for paedobaptism, Baptists insisted that the ordinance was reserved for adults who wished to affirm their membership in the Reformed Church. Okay, and that's what most of the histories will say, something to that effect. And of course, all that is true, right? There's nothing wrong with that assessment. But I think it's incomplete. I think it's incomplete. Because here's the problem. Yes, it's true that the particular Baptists didn't find paedobaptism in the New Testament. And they affirm this over and over again. Just one example, John Spilsbury, particular Baptist, he says there is neither command nor example for the baptizing of infants in all the New Testament. And similar appeals to New Testament silence are found basically in everything that these people published during the period. So in a sense, that's right. But it's not complete because here's the problem. Everybody said they had scriptural warrant for everything they did during this period. So why was it only in the late 1630s and 1640s that people all of a sudden realized that the New Testament doesn't have explicit examples of babies being baptized? What took them so long? What took a people that had long been animated by the spirit of William Chillingworth's 1638 declaration? He said, the Bible only is the religion of Protestants. And William Chillingworth was not a Baptist. Everybody was looking for scriptural warrant. So what took them so long? So to say that they rejected it because it was unbiblical, it doesn't tell us why they rejected it when they did. What changed? What cultural, societal, theological conditions had shifted such that this move was conceptually possible in the late 1630s? And that, to me, is the more interesting question. Here's a quote that I like from an historian, Edmund Morgan. He says, "Change in Christian thought has usually been a matter of emphasis, of giving certain ideas a greater weight than was previously accorded them, or of carrying one idea to its logical conclusion at the expense of another." So new religious innovations then, doctrinal shifts, don't just sort of spontaneously appear, but rather they emerge organically as already existing ideas are reassessed, creatively rearranged, modified, and new ideas are possible. And we see this when we're looking at the development of just about any doctrine. And if we apply this insight then to the question of baptism, I think that we can make progress if we attend to the ecclesiological debates that were happening around the same time. What were people saying about the nature of the visible church? Now, to say that the key to discovering baptism is found in thinking about the visible church might at first seem counterintuitive. Why would you do that? And when we talk about the visible church, of course, we're talking about the church as it outwardly appears, visibly to us, as it's embodied in real structures and real worshipers, those who are taking the name Christ upon their lips. In other words, that which we can see with our eyes, the visible church, right? And though that might seem far removed from sacramentology, from the ordinance of baptism, the connection makes more sense when we remember that baptism is an outward sign of entry into and inclusion within this visible church. That's what baptism is. As one Puritan put it, baptism is a Christian's formal enrollment amongst the members of the visible church. And if we think about it that way then, what we see is that the baptism debate was therefore only on one level about baptism itself. At a more basic level, when we talk about who should be baptized, we're talking about the composition of the church. We're talking about the composition of God's covenant people. That's what we're talking about. And during the first half of the 17th century, what we find is that lots of Puritan thinkers were creatively rearranging long-held notions about the nature of the visible church, about the nature of God's visible covenant people. They arrived at the idea of the believer's church. And this, I would say, is where we find the roots of believer's baptism and what made it possible when it was. But to understand that, I think we need to understand why the Reformers embraced paedobaptism in the first place. We have to start there because that's where all this grows out of. Why did the Reformers embrace paedobaptism? Because remember, all of the particular Baptists that we read about in the 1640s would have at one time been paedobaptists. At one time, they would have been paedobaptists. They would have been baptized themselves in infancy, and presumably, for quite a long time, they would have held that baptizing infants was in keeping with Scripture. So what made them change? And why did they once believe that this was a biblical practice? Well, to answer that question, unfortunately, is not as straightforward as one might imagine. And this is because after the Reformation, Protestants in the magisterial tradition overturned the clear and powerful rationale for paedobaptism that had sustained it for some time. Namely, the 16th century Reformers rejected the long-standing teaching from Augustine onwards that baptism effectively removed the guilt of original sin. And they replaced it with a justification for infant baptism that was, if not less convincing, certainly less straightforward. You see, the Roman Catholic Church gives a straightforward explanation for why one might baptize an infant. It might not be biblical, but it is clear. Let's see. The Roman Catholic Church tells us that we baptize a baby because this baptism is an objective rite that takes away original sin ex opere operato, by the work performed. So in other words, when that baby is baptized, something actually happens. It actually changes something. Something is different. This baby's spiritual state is changed objectively and in reality because of the work performed. It's not representing a spiritual thing that's already happened. It actually is helping to bring about that which it signifies. And this is what Rome teaches today. This is the catechism, the contemporary catechism. This sacrament is also called the washing of regeneration and renewal by the Holy Spirit, for it signifies and actually brings about the birth of water and the Spirit, without which no one can enter the kingdom of God. So there's the key line there. It actually brings about what it signifies. Now, the Reformers could not go in for this. The magisterial Reformers rejected not only this view of baptism, but the whole ex opere operato sacramental system that this represents. But what are they going to replace it with? Because they keep the practice of infant baptism. And so what we have then, as the late David Wright explained it very well, he says that in affirming infant baptism, whilst undergirding its historical foundation, the leaders of the Protestant Reformations in the 16th century perpetuated a rite which had first come into its own and was sustained for virtually all centuries by doctrinal stipulations which they could no longer endorse. So that's the situation they find themselves in. And what are they going to do? Well, Martin Luther, about whom we've heard much over the past year, Martin Luther actually puts forward the basic gist as early as January 1522. In a letter to Philip Melanchthon, he says that circumcision has the same power as baptism. And so here you see the basic logic of the Reformers' doctrine of paedobaptism through an appeal to Old Testament circumcision. The sign of the Old Testament covenant people was circumcision. It was administered to babies. Therefore, the sign of entry into the covenant under the New Testament administration is baptism, so we should do likewise. This is the basic logic. But ultimately, it wouldn't be Lutherans, it would be rather the Reformed, who would really seize upon this analogy with circumcision and develop it. So John Calvin, for instance, he argued that before baptism was instituted, God's people had circumcision instead. And so whatever belongs to circumcision pertains likewise to baptism. And of particular importance to the Reformers, of course, was the covenantal context in which circumcision was given to Abraham in Genesis 17. Visibly, physically marking out, separating those who are part of God's covenant people, distinguishing them from all who are not within what Reformed divines would come to describe as the covenant of grace. So this is the basic idea. Calvin, another quote from Calvin, he says that, seeing that the Lord, immediately after making this covenant with Abraham, commanded it to be sealed in infants by an outward sacrament, what excuse will Christians give for not testifying and sealing it in their children today? Likewise, the Heidelberg Catechism, 1563, puts it this way: infants, as well as their parents, are included in the covenant and belong to the people of God. Through baptism, the Catechism tells us, infants are to be incorporated into the Christian church and distinguished from the children of unbelievers. So the important thing then to realize here is that for the Reformed, for the magisterial Reformers, what we see here is that baptism, the doctrine of baptism, becomes much more about ecclesiology than soteriology. They're less interested in how baptism actually saves, and they're more interested in how baptism becomes a marker of who is within the covenant community in a visible, outward sense. And this is a key distinction. All right. There's a problem, though, with this. There's a problem. And you're probably thinking, well, there's lots of problems with this. But I mean, for the Reformers themselves, there's a problem with this. Because in theology, of course, right, we can't just change one little piece and expect everything else to stay as it was, right? Our doctrine is, at least in theory, meant to form a coherent, interlocking puzzle. So if you shift one piece of your doctrine, other pieces will be affected, won't they? You can't escape this. So then our question then, if we're trying to piece this together historically, is when the Reformers made their shift and they instituted a new explanation for infant baptism, what did that affect? What did that shift? What were the consequences of that? So here we have the same thing we've been talking about, just illustrated here, practice of infant baptism, and then it's resting on this Roman Catholic rationale for infant baptism. The magisterial reformers come along, they keep the practice. They keep the practice, but they say no to the rationale. They institute a new rationale. So what does that do for their theology? And I would argue that when they do this, one of the results, is that an aspect of their doctrine that had always kind of been there, but maybe it was more in the background, becomes much more prominent. And as we move from the 16th century into looking at English divines in the 17th century, this idea just keeps getting pushed further to the forefront. What are we talking about? They made more prominent the idea that the New Testament church was to be an inherently mixed body. An inherently mixed body. In other words, a body in which true believers, those who are truly regenerate inwardly, spiritually, are worshiping alongside those who actually have no true saving faith. That's what the church is. It's an inherently mixed body. And this idea was always there, but it's becoming more prominent, I argue, as a result here of this shift in baptism. So Calvin says something like this: "In this church are mingled many hypocrites who have nothing of Christ but the name and outward appearance." And this idea then, foregrounding this idea that this is what the church is. This is by God's design. The church, here and now, the visible church, is an inherently mixed one in which you have hypocrites who know nothing of true saving faith, worshiping alongside those who do. This idea is sort of the inevitable result, isn't it, of combining a reformed doctrine of predestination, the idea that God must monergistically work in people totally apart from their merits to bring them to a point of true saving faith. When you take that idea and you combine it with a national comprehensive state church into which all the babies are baptized, this is the result. You get this foregrounding of the notion that our visible church will be an inherently mixed body and that this is God's intent for his church until glory. And we see this then all throughout their writings. We see that when pastors, during the magisterial Reformation, when they considered their flocks, when they addressed their flocks, when they preached to those gathered, they saw a group of people who were all baptized, who had all been marked as external members in this covenant community. They all had the sign. And yet these ministers knew full well that not everyone, perhaps not even most, of the people that were associated with their parishes, they knew that most of them weren't really regenerate internally. And yet they regarded the whole mixed multitude as the true covenant people of God in this outward sense. And this idea is just reinforced. Once joined to the covenant community through water baptism, there was a hope and expectation that this infant would one day grow in the nurture of the church and give evidence of saving faith. But if that never happened, well, that's okay, because the Reformed reappraisal of baptismal efficacy detached the application of the sacrament. The application of the sacrament, the administration of the sacrament, was now detached from the faith toward which it was meant to point. And you have this idea of a mixed body. There's a group of Reformed divines at the University of Leiden in 1625, and they summarized it like this. They said, "The efficacy of baptism was not necessarily tied to the moment at which the body is wet with outward water, but rather it is at the moment when real faith and repentance was brought forward." They elaborated it like this. They said, "As seed cast upon the ground does not always germinate at the same moment, but when rain and warmth supervene from heaven, so neither word nor sign of sacrament is always effectual at its first moment, but only at the time when the blessing of the Holy Spirit is added." Only when the blessing of the Holy Spirit is added. But of course, if that blessing never came for many of the infants who were baptized, it didn't really matter. because this strong emphasis on the fundamentally mixed nature of the visible church ensured that you could still regard all the visible church as truly in the covenant, in at least an external or outward sense. And these ideas, by the mid-17th century, among English divines, this idea of the church as an inherently mixed body has become even more well developed. Infant baptism was understood as a sign of covenantal inclusion in the visible church, corresponding to Old Testament circumcision, and this idea then led to this notion of the church as a mixed body. And we see that, for instance, in the writings of someone like John Ball, who was a very influential English Puritan. And he develops this idea of the covenant of grace as consisting of, first you have the big circle, the external members. So this is anyone basically who's been baptized in the triune name. If you're baptized in the triune name, that's your mark of being externally in the covenant community. But then Ball and others really develop this idea that there's also an internal community. You have external members and internal members. And they're both really legitimately in the covenant, but just some are external only, and some are internally members. So listen to how he explains this. He says, externally, this covenant, the covenant of grace, is made with every member of the church, even with the parents and their children. But then he says that within this comprehensive external covenant, there was this other smaller group that were included savingly, effectually, and in a special manner. These are those who are members internally. And Ball then tells us that all, then, are not in covenant after one manner. Those that be outwardly in covenant partake the outward and basest part of the covenant, while they that be truly in covenant obtain the highest. So what are we seeing here then? What are we seeing? What is Ball doing? He's effectively dividing the church into two tiers. You have those who are just external members, and then you have those who are really members, the people who have really been regenerated by the Spirit of God. And the idea was that as a minister, you can't tell the one from the other, but that's okay, because everyone in the whole nation, the whole state, we're all members of this church together. Some of us are internal, some are external, and we don't really know who's who, and that's okay. That's not our business to know. Our business is just to baptize all the members of the state and regard them as externally members of God's covenant community. And so you can see then how this picture of what the church is with this two-tiered structure works very well with infant baptism, doesn't it? It makes sense with infant baptism. It helps to make infant baptism work because you already have accepted this idea that the church is fundamentally mixed. So if you have a baby who's baptized, he's just as much an external member of the church, of the visible church, as anyone else. And this distinction in turn then merges seamlessly with England's comprehensive national church. We have a national church in which civic identity and ecclesiastical identity are one and the same. They're one in the same. You can't be a member of the state without also being a member of the church. The historian Patrick Collinson writes that this was an age of preachers who knew that they faced congregations of great diversity. The godly community was at once a remnant and a multitude. And under such conditions, then, infant baptism is a natural corollary. You have a situation in which the composition of the church coterminous with the composition of the state. Christian parents have Christian children who are baptized and compose together a Christian nation. You see this in the Westminster Directory of Public Worship, which replaced the Book of Common Prayer in 1645. They write, parents bringing children forward for baptism are told that babies born to Christian parents are Christians and federally holy before baptism, and therefore they are baptized. So listen to this again. So babies born to Christian parents are Christians and federally holy before baptism, and therefore they are baptized. So this is a strong view that if you are indeed a member of this external community, you are in a real sense a Christian. It's a completely different view than we have with a believer's church composed of those professing faith. So then, you have all of these ideas. They're reinforcing each other. And then one final wrinkle that we add to all of this is that all of these ideas worked very well with England's very well-documented sense of itself as something of a second Israel. So if you read early modern sources at this time, what you find is that... I'm behind myself. What you find is at this time, everyone talks about, all the ministers talk about England as very much an analog with Old Testament Israel. Israel was a chosen nation, and we are a chosen nation. So, for instance, one parish minister, Emmanuel Nuttons, he affirms readily and in passing that the Church of England was as true a national church as the Jewish church was. And in addition, then, to supplying the basic analog upon which Protestant justifications of infant baptism were based, you can also see how taking ancient Israel as your model models for us a theocratic state in which the civil life and the ecclesiastical life of the nation are basically one and the same. We're all members of this covenant community, and that outward membership has little or anything to do with inward spiritual renewal. And this is the situation that English Puritans found themselves in. And so what we see then are three basic strands that form this theological context out of which 17th century Congregationalists and Baptists arose. Three mutually reinforcing strands. We've talked about the near universal baptism of infants, the near universal baptism of infants. We have a comprehensive state church into which to baptize them. And then we have a strong sense of analogy between England and Old Testament Israel. And when you combine these things, you get this very strong distinction between God's covenant people as having an external membership, which comprehends the whole state, and then an internal membership that comprehends only those who actually have underwent saving regeneration and profess true saving faith. All right, so this is the context. And what we see, and what we'll talk about next time, is that a group of Puritans are unhappy with this. They're unhappy with this. And they start pulling at the threads of this. And these are the people that we label Congregationalists. They start pulling at the threads of this whole state, church, religious, civil nexus. They pull at the threads and they unravel it. And they embrace a believer's church. But then what we'll see is that in doing so, they didn't just stop there, but many of them went on to see how now that we've dismantled the national church and we've embraced a believer's church, that requires even more theological refiguring. Because once you move to a believer's church, believer's baptism becomes a logical, theological necessity. And that's what we'll talk about, I hope, next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, very much indeed. Are there any questions immediately following from... We're going to have a session of Q&A tomorrow afternoon, so there will be additional opportunity after reflection. But if there's any immediate questions, Ray, first of all?
Yes, thank you. That was excellent. That was very helpful. Is there a second point there at the end, this sort of union between civil and religious? What was the underlying fear of losing that? Why didn't they just say, that's not biblical? Was there an underlying fear of if they did actually divide the civil and the religious unity?
Yeah. I think that it was just so woven into the nature of the society at this time that the idea of undoing it, it was just almost unthinkable. And this would be a larger conversation, but I think that if you look at the dynamics of Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic soteriology, I think, suits quite well this idea of a national church in which everyone is at least in some formal outward way connected. But the Reformation and a Reformation soteriology just doesn't fit with that. And so then the question becomes, why didn't the magisterial reformers do away with the magistrate? And I think, and perhaps this is cynical, but I think it's the reality, it had everything to do with the pragmatic considerations of the day. And you needed the magistrate's protection, or you're not going to have a church, and you're not going to have a Reformation. So it's interesting to see, and I guess this touches on how we think about history and the providence of God and God using means. And we see, very sort of fallible human men and women who are sort of moving bit by bit, hopefully towards what these guys would have called godly reformation, and we can take that term today. But thank you.
Muslim.
When did this sort of idea of England being a kind of second Israel or inheriting the promises, was that John Fox in the 16th century, or was it before that became?
Yeah. I think that if you look at John Fox's Book of Martyrs in the 16th century, that book is fairly widely regarded as having done more to shape England's sort of national consciousness than any other book save the Bible. And certainly, with Fox's Book of Martyrs, you get this notion that here is the Reformation and here is God's special place, and there were all these persecutions, and the apostolic church was persecuted, and the true church has been persecuted, and then here under Queen Mary, godly Protestants in England have been persecuted. And you get this whole mythos. But I don't think it's all John Fox's creation. I think he certainly would have popularized it and would have reinforced that. But you see, for instance, Edward is portrayed as the new King Josiah. This young King Josiah. They're constantly drawing on Old Testament analogies. For instance, Scottish divines, and even ones that will be published, and read today by people like ourselves, like Samuel Rutherford, they talk and really use really extreme language. And now we're moving beyond England, of course, but he'll talk about, the reason that things, kind of didn't go well for us there in the late 1640s was because we took a king. And in the Old Testament, God warns, this is what happens when you have a king, and they're just drawing all these analogies at every turn between the Old Testament and their own political situation. I would say, John Fox is certainly a great driver of this idea, but I don't think it's just him. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
These external members of the covenant, as it were, did they believe that they would be saved at the last day? And if they didn't, then in what sort of sense would they consider part of any sort of covenant?
Yeah, see, that's so no. And if you're externally in the covenant, but you're not internally in the covenant, you are what we would regard as an unsaved person, right? But it's interesting. So somebody like John Ball, he has this treatise on the covenant of grace that I quoted from. He actually talks at some length about the benefits and the blessings of being a member of the external covenant. And he says that he talks about how, most people, the vast majority of people in far lands, they're not even members externally. And what a blessing to even be externally members of the covenant. So they would have seen it as, so this would be blessing that would flow to you, say, just as living in a godly nation and having the covenant blessings and being exposed to preaching. And they would have talked about how that could, for instance, help you to restrain perhaps your sinful appetites. The preaching of the law could have had some, godly effect on your life and sort of saved you from yourself, as it were, to some degree. Think of the biblical image of heaping up judgment upon themselves. Well, if you're an external member of the covenant, perhaps the moral reformation that these godly people are effecting would save you in that sense from further judgment, that kind of thing. But no, the short answer is the external members, from our position, from our perspective, from a Baptist perspective, they're not saved, they're not regenerate, they're not Christians. But when you have this strong sense of an external, outward covenant, they can be legitimately regarded as Christians, regardless of whether or not they ever profess faith. And we see that in the quote from the Westminster Directory of Public Worship when it says these babies are Christians. And I don't know about you, but I've seen I've seen a fair number of our Presbyterian brothers, perform infant baptisms, and I don't often hear them using language that is that strong. But that's what's in the Westminster Public Directory.
So lots of false assurance. Yes, Oliver.
Thank you so much. It was really, really helpful, very interesting. Your point about the move from baptism viewed soteriologically in the Roman Catholic perspective, and baptism now viewed ecclesiologically by the magisterial reformers, is really needs further thought. I've got to go away and think about that. Was that a purely negative thing? Did that happen because they couldn't possibly continue with the Roman Catholic view, and so had to come up with something else? Were you hinting that is why they went in that direction, or was it a positive thing? And when did that begin to emerge? Where could we perhaps read more about that? It seems very important to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is, and I should say, obviously, for a Roman Catholic as well, there's obviously a strong ecclesiological dimension, right? So for anybody, baptism is a sign of entry into the visible church. So it's not as though they didn't have that ecclesiological emphasis, but for the reformers, they're just sort of de-emphasizing this objective salvific power of the rite, of course, because they're tossing aside the whole sacramental system. So and then you get I think our Paedobaptist friends would say this is overly cynical, but for me, it really does look like they have to keep paedobaptism because the whole civil society is sort of predicated on this idea. There's a really interesting book that was published recently about Calvin's view of paedobaptism and how it functioned in Geneva, and this historian talks at length about how paedobaptism really functioned as a sort of communal glue, and that this was just a huge part of it. And so to baptize a baby, it had all these connotations and implications beyond just whatever, the minister thought he was doing theologically. It sort of held people together, and you had godparents who were involved, and it was a big thing. So, I kind of can't help but see it as, we have this doctrine. We really can't buy into the reason that basically everyone has been baptizing these babies for the past 1,000 years or whatever it was. But we're sort of stuck with the practice. So now we have a practice in search of a theological justification. And again, maybe that's sort of cynical, I think, maybe to some. But, and you see with people like Zwingli and others, you see this initial move away from paedobaptism when the Reformation first gets going, and then it's all of a sudden, that's really just not going to fly. Again, and that's
doesn't it with the Anabaptists who embraced second baptism, but also were social, radicals. It seems to me that they also married together church and state in that sense. So if we were going to have a second baptism, we've got to be disconnected from the state as well completely.
Yeah.
Almost as though they were on the other extreme of the same problem.
Yeah, and the radical Reformation and the Anabaptists, they're an interesting one, because we always want to wonder. So is that kind of where we come from as Baptists today? And the thing I always think about is, if we believe that believers' baptism is what the Bible teaches, then it shouldn't surprise us that lots of different people in different contexts might see this truth, But their relationship to the state was very fraught. And when you look at the discourse in the mid-17th century in an English context, when the enemies of the particular Baptists are constantly hurling this label Anabaptist at them, it's often in the context of, you guys are going to dissolve the civil state, just like your friends in Germany did, and you often see that rhetoric of this will bring about a second Münster, a reference to this town in Germany where Anabaptists basically took over the town and instituted all sorts of strange practices. But, thank you.
Yeah, Ray. Matthew, thank you. I found it quite brilliant. I really did. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for all the hard work that's behind that. Massively appreciated. The three strands of question were this near universal baptism of infants, the state church into which everyone's baptised, and the analogy to Israel. How strong are those factors in present-day paedobaptism? I remember having a discussion with an Anglican vicar, a lovely evangelical Anglican vicar, years and years ago, and he used the parable of the weeds to say this is the way the church is. I was a young Turk, I was a bit awkward and touchy, but didn't Jesus say it was the world? And he and I thought, wow, this is 300 years later, that same argument's still being used. Now those things are changing very radically. We don't have near universal baptism. We don't have a state church. How are pedo-Baptists grappling with that now? Because that was their rationale then. How do they cope with it now?
Oh, well, you should give the second talk. You have hit the nail on the head. You've marvelously anticipated. I mean, to me, so one of the points that I think we can draw from these historical reflections in terms of application to our own situation, and I'll try to save some of it for tomorrow or Thursday, but basically is what you said, because I think that. And I'm mostly, in terms of the Paedo-Baptist friends I have, I'm mostly familiar with Presbyterians. I'd be less familiar with the spectrum of Anglican theology operative today. But amongst the Presbyterian friends that I have, you ask, well, how are they thinking about those three strands today? And I don't think they really are. I don't think any of those three strands really are very operative in the minds of our Presbyterian brothers and sisters. And so then the question becomes, so why are you still doing this? So, for instance, the quote from the Westminster Directory I read there, where it says that this baby is baptized because it is a Christian. It is a Christian. It's federally holy because it's born to believing parents, and so it's born into the covenant community. It's in the external covenant already. It is a Christian baby, and that's why you baptize it. When I've heard Presbyterian friends, and maybe your Presbyterian friends are different than mine, but when I've heard them baptize babies and talk about that, many of them go to great lengths to affirm the opposite. And they're affirming to the congregation, now look, don't think for a minute, this is not a Christian here just because we're doing this. This means, X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right on the money. I think that the historical context in which paedobaptism made sense has basically evaporated. And so then the practice, I think, is sort of hanging out there in a way that doesn't quite cohere, maybe as it would have in the 17th century.
I mean, there is something in the Westminster Confession of Faith about magistrates enforcing good doctrine, isn't there? But modern Presbyterians tend to drop that out. They're rather embarrassed, aren't they, about that? Yeah. Paul.
Sorry, my brain's just trying to catch up here. So there's this disentangling of baptism as seeing the church and state separately. Does that help us understand why paedobaptism began, why Augustine is kicking things off, and a greater sense of why it's coming in? Is it connected to Christendom, Constantine, those sorts of things? Is it really helpful to read on that? Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting coincidence, isn't it, that this all sort of comes about at the time when you see Christendom coming into existence. The best thing that I've ever read on this subject is, just looking for the name of the actual book, but it's by David Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, who was in Edinburgh. David F. Wright. There's a book that he has called Infant Baptism in Historical Perspective, Collected Studies. And I don't know how widely available, I don't know if it's still in print. It's one of these Paternoster publications, if you've seen these. But it's a collection of essays that he's written, and they're all over the place, but they've been collected very helpfully. And he has some really, I think, rather devastating historical reflections on these very questions, on how paedobaptism arose. And I was astonished. I started reading this, and I didn't know much about David Wright. And then, and maybe someone here can correct me if I'm wrong, but someone told me, no, he was a Presbyterian, he was a Paedo-Baptist himself. And that, when I heard that, I couldn't believe it, because I thought, how could you write these things and then continue with this practice? Because if you read it, the quote I had in there, here, this is David Wright. The leaders of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century perpetuated a rite which had first come into its own and was sustained for virtually all its centuries-long medieval life by doctrinal stipulations which they could no longer endorse. Now, I think that's sort of a devastating critique. And it also, I would say, and I don't want to be overly polemical, but it also, I think, sort of undercuts the thing that's often thrown at Baptists. People will say, look, the church has been baptizing infants for 2,000 years, and you come along and relatively late in the game, and you reject this practice, but we've got this weight of tradition. But the problem is, as David Wright points out, our Paedo-Baptist friends in the Protestant world
don't affirm the rationale for paedobaptism that was operative for the 1500 or whatever the years would be, 1,000 years before the Reformation. So, again, I would recommend the David Wright book to you, Infant Baptism in Historical Perspective.